Some houses don't just hold memories. They bury secrets, stitched into silence, hidden behind walls that still whisper at night. And when those stitches begin to unravel, it's not just the truth that comes undone, but entire lives. This is the story of such a house, where a name was stolen, a truth buried, and a woman didn't seek revenge. She simply claimed her place back, not with fury, but with quiet grace. The village of Dunsmuir, cradled between time-worn hills and a restless stretch of shadowed forest, seemed untouched by urgency, its winding cobblestone lanes draped in a stillness so deep it felt rehearsed. Wisteria hung heavy on the stone walls, and the air was rich with damp moss and secrets that had slept undisturbed for generations. It was into this suspended hush that Miss Eliza Wren arrived, her figure modest but firm, eyes alert behind the soft curve of her spectacles, carrying the kind of presence that didn't announce itself but rather seeped in like fog. She was greeted by Mrs. Felton, a widow with pale fingers, a voice like faded parchment, and the kind of nervous warmth that trembled at the edges. The cottage hadn't changed, its beams still sagged with memory, its corners smelled faintly of time and wax, and every creak in the floorboards sounded like a name almost spoken. Over steaming tea and the brittle clink of antique china, conversation turned, as it always did in Dunsmuir, to what was best left untouched. The sewing room, long locked since Clara Felton, her sister-in-law, had vanished on a fog-heavy morning 10 years past, stood sealed at the hallway's end, its door bowed with time and silence. "I couldn't bear to change it," Mrs. Felton whispered, her eyes not quite meeting Eliza's. "It's as if she never left. Or worse, as if she never really disappeared at all." That night, just before the pale tremor of dawn broke through the trees, the scream came, a jagged sound from young Nora the maid, who stumbled into the hallway with soot on her hands and terror in her voice. Smoke curled from beneath the sewing room's threshold, bitter and clinging, like something long buried trying to escape. The village fire brigade, more accustomed to rescuing cats than facing true danger, arrived quickly, their boots thudding like judgment. The flames had already begun to die, but what they left behind was far from ordinary. The fire hadn't spread like a wild thing, it had stayed localized, deliberate, almost cautious. Eliza, who watched without a word, noted with growing unease that no outlet had sparked, no iron lay melted in the ashes, and no logical source presented itself. The floor around the embroidery cabinet bore the most damage, yet nothing around it had been used in years. It was the youngest fireman, son of the church bell ringer, who tapped along the base of the cabinet and paused as his knuckles echoed hollow. With a slow, wary twist of a blade, he pried loose a hidden panel behind it, a small compartment, blackened by heat but still intact. Inside, wrapped in oil-stained muslin, lay two things: a velvet hair ribbon, midnight blue and singed at the edges but still holding the faint ghostly scent of lavender water, and a crumpled, half-burnt letter, its ink smeared like tears on skin. Eliza leaned in as the bundle was gently opened, her gloved fingers trembling only slightly as the brittle paper unfolded to reveal fragmented lines. "She must never know. I buried it for her sake. If found, it means she remembers." The words struck like a chill down the spine, and in that moment, as wind hissed through the shattered pane and ash danced in the light like restless spirits, Eliza knew this was no accident. Clara hadn't vanished. She had been hidden, forgotten, or perhaps worse, remembered only by those who feared what she might become if the truth surfaced. And now the fire hadn't destroyed the past, it had awakened it. Zara Hastings stepped off the train at Elmbrook Station as dusk fell like a shroud across the moor, her figure silhouetted in the twilight like the return of something half-remembered and wholly feared. She was dressed in black, not fashionable mourning, but the kind worn for unfinished funerals, and carried only a single suitcase, battered and creaking with the weight of something more than clothes. The villagers watched from behind curtains and hedges, their lips still but their eyes busy, for though no one spoke her name, they all knew it. Zara, the niece of the reclusive Professor Aldous Greenlaw, the man whose sprawling manor Cromere Hall had loomed silent and sealed since his sudden death a year prior. There had been no obituary, no public service, only whispers of strange lights in the upper windows and an old gardener who'd quit without explanation. Yet now, after 30 years away, Zara had returned, unannounced, her expression composed but her eyes ringed with old shadows. When she reached the manor gates, the wind rose as if to resist her entry, hissing through the overgrown ivy that strangled the stone arch. Inside, the house had been left untouched, dust coated every surface, the air heavy with the scent of paper, decay and something older still, like time itself, had thickened in the corners. In the drawing room, beneath the grand portrait of Sybil Greenlaw, her mother, long dead though no one recalled a funeral, Zara lit a fire that crackled not warmly but warily, as if protesting its own rekindling. She placed a small tarnished locket on the mantel beside the antique clock, its clasp rusted and stiff, and when she finally pried it open, it revealed a painted image of a little girl with stormy eyes and a frown etched too deeply for a child. That night, as rain began to lash the manor walls and thunder crawled over the hills, the West Wing's bell rang out sharply, clearly, despite having been disconnected since the 1980s. Mrs. Elkins, the aging housekeeper who'd only agreed to stay one more night, locked herself in her quarters, whispering prayers she hadn't used in years. But Zara, barefoot and silent, walked through the dark corridors with a candle trembling in her grip, past ancestral portraits that seemed to follow her with glassy eyes, past doors that had once been locked and were now slightly ajar. The nursery door creaked open before she touched it. Inside, time had held its breath, dolls sat frozen mid-tea, toy soldiers stood on forgotten battlefields, and a tiny bed bore a faint, child-sized impression in the dust. Atop the coverlet lay an envelope, its yellowed paper sealed with red wax bearing the Greenlaw family crest. Hands steady, breath shallow, Zara opened it. The letter within was written in a fragile, looping script, no name signed, addressed simply to who finds this. She is not dead, she was never buried, her name was taken, her story erased. If you are reading this, it means the house is waking again. Zara stood motionless, the letter trembling between her fingers as a soft sound drifted from behind her, a giggle, faint and high and wrong, like a child trying to remember how to be one. The candle flickered though no wind touched it, and the temperature fell sharply, as if something had entered the room. Zara turned slowly, but nothing was there. Only the mirror on the wall, reflecting the room, and behind her, a second figure, small, barefoot, with eyes like hers. Upstairs, the grand portrait of Sybil Greenlaw had shifted. Barely, but undeniably, its painted eyes now seeming to look not outward but inward, as if the house had begun to remember. Outside, the thunder did not roll. It spoke, low and long, and in the manor's silent bones something ancient stirred. Zara had not returned to mourn. She had come to uncover the truth, a truth buried so deeply in the marrow of the walls that to awaken it might mean losing herself entirely. Yet still, she did not run. Instead, with the letter pressed to her chest, and the candlelight flickering against her wide, unblinking eyes, she whispered into the dark, "I know who you are." And somewhere in the house, behind the walls, behind the years, something smiled. When the bell tolled at Elder Hollow for the reading of the late Colonel Ainsworth's will, it echoed not just through the crooked chimneys and ivy-wrapped steeples of the village, but through memory itself, rousing long-forgotten glances, half-buried suspicions, and the dry rustle of secrets that had lain dormant too long. The village did not merely stir, it bristled, like something buried deep in its soil had shifted, disturbed by the weight of a name once spoken with both reverence and quiet fear. Rowena Blackwell arrived first, stepping from a motor car whose wheels crunched the gravel path like bones beneath snow. She was the Colonel's ward, or so she had long insisted, with the kind of grace that dares contradiction. Her face pale and unmoving, like wax that remembers heat, and eyes that lingered half a second too long on bolted drawers and attic staircases. Following at a carefully measured distance was Lawrence Blythe, a cousin in only the loosest genealogical sense, his presence a performance wrapped in pinstripes, his every smile rehearsed, and his tales of Parisian nights and Venetian balls filled with a hollow grandiosity that seemed stitched together from old novels and dim bar-room echoes. But it was Mr. Fenwick who most unsettled those gathered, the solicitor who never seemed to blink long enough, whose shoes bore no trace of the journey, whose fingers brushed papers with such care it seemed he feared waking the ink. His voice was a smooth and sterile instrument, each word precisely placed, each pause honed to let the tension bloom between syllables. He spoke little, but his silences said more than others' confessions. He listened like a man who already knew the final page, and merely waited to watch others flounder through the prologue. As the tea cooled in untouched china, and the fire in the grate flickered low and blue, conversation curled through the drawing room like pipe smoke, faint, directionless yet heavy with things unsaid. The villagers spoke not in declarations but in gestures and allusions, their tongues more careful than honest. They whispered of Rowena's solitary walks on the moor at ungodly hours. Was it grief that drove her, or calculation? They noted how Lawrence's fingers twitched whenever the Colonel's portrait loomed into view, and how Mr. Fenwick's gaze lingered not on the family silver, but on the hallway that led toward the shuttered nursery. It was old Mrs. Whitcomb, her memory brittle but unyielding, who finally voiced what others only orbited. They never did find Emmeline's locket, did they? And with that single name the temperature in the room seemed to fall. Emmeline, the Colonel's only daughter, had vanished 17 years ago on a summer evening without wind, her absence marked only by a torn sketchbook found at the edge of the walled garden and a nursery mirror turned deliberately to face the wallpaper. No body, no goodbye, just a silence so unnatural it seemed to hum. The case had gone cold long before the tea had. Some whispered she ran away, others that she was taken, and a few too afraid to say it aloud believed she never left the manor at all. That evening, as dusk spilled across the village in slow strokes, Rowena stood at the parlour mantel, her hand resting upon a candlestick untouched since the night of the child's disappearance, its wax fused to the brass like a wound refusing to heal. The grandfather clock, silent for a decade, gave a single chime that no one acknowledged but all heard. Upstairs, the blue room's gas lamp sputtered and failed, though the wick was new and the air still. Miss Hargreaves, who'd spent a lifetime among ghost stories and first editions, later claimed she saw a delicate hand draw back the curtain in the nursery window, a hand far too small for any adult and far too pale for the living. No one dared investigate. Downstairs, Rowena opened the envelope, its seal suspiciously torn though no one had touched it, and withdrew a single sheet. There was no legal clause, no estate division, just one sentence handwritten in a curling, unfamiliar script that trembled at the edges. Ask her where the thimble is. The room froze. Lawrence, always so slick with words, fumbled for his drink and missed entirely, the glass tumbling to the rug without shattering. Mr. Fenwick, usually unreadable, turned just slightly toward the staircase, and Rowena, composed, graceful, invulnerable Rowena, finally faltered, her gaze drifting upward to the open nursery door that none recalled opening. The air grew dense and an ancient cold slithered down the walls like a memory returning to reclaim its space. Something unseen passed through the room, silent but undeniable, and those present began to realize with breathless clarity that the manor had not simply kept its secrets, it had guarded them, fed them, and perhaps mourned them in its own quiet way. And now whatever pact it had made with silence had come undone. The dead do not speak, they say, but in Elder Hollow they never had to. The house remembers everything. When the ancient shutters of Greystone Hollow creaked open for the long-dreaded reading of the reclusive Lady Virelum's final testament, the village of Elowick-on-Marsh did not simply react. It recoiled, as though the manor's breathless silence had been keeping something far more sinister at bay. For years the house had stood brooding on the edge of the moor, watching with shuttered eyes and a locked gate, its windows glinting like old secrets too bitter to bury. The villagers had long spoken of the lady in hushed tones of her odd rituals, the locked music room no one entered, and the faint piano strains sometimes heard when the house was otherwise empty. But now, with the tolling of the church bell and the black carriage crunching across gravel not touched in a decade, that silence shattered. Those summoned were not all kin, and that was the first whisper to spread. Alara Winecombe, Lady Virelum's adopted niece, more rumour than relation, was first to cross the threshold, her mourning veil too translucent for modesty, her perfume sweet and wrong for grief. She carried with her a worn velvet pouch containing the brooch she claimed was the lady's favourite, set with a milky opalescent stone that always seemed colder than the air around it. Her arrival stirred little warmth, even from the manor itself, whose front doors sighed open not with welcome, but with reluctant obedience. Behind her came Tobias Gray, a man whose name had never graced the church rolls or the grocer's ledger, yet who walked with the assurance of someone returning rather than visiting. His pale eyes flicked to the corners of rooms before he entered them, and though his hands were bare, there was something of gloves about him, a layer unseen, a quiet filter between him and the world. He said he had come on Lady Virelum's invitation, though she had died weeks before he arrived. The solicitor, Mr. Silas Hemlow, followed with deliberate slowness, thin as a ledger and pale as moth wings, with shoes too polished and hands too smooth for a man who handled old papers. He carried a black leather case embossed with the Virelum crest, 3 thorns encircling a closed eye, and placed it on the long-forgotten parlour table, as if setting down a tomb. The rest arrived in 2s and 3s. Harriet Culver, the lady's cousin, once removed and twice dismissed, Reverend Alton, who had denounced the Hollow from his pulpit, yet never refused its tithe, and Molly Trask, the grown daughter of a maid who vanished from the estate without so much as a letter 17 winters past. They did not speak much as they gathered, their eyes instead drawn to the cracked mirror above the hearth, recently uncovered and inexplicably clean. As the wind rose outside and the lamps flickered with more than mere draught, Hemlow cleared his throat, not out of need but as ritual, and broke the wax seal of the will with the precision of a surgeon. The parchment crackled, its ink faded but legible, and he began to read in a voice that seemed to scrape against the edges of the room. Let it be known that Greystone Hollow, its lands and legacy, its debts and devotions, be granted not to blood nor name, but to the one who returned what was never lost. He paused, waiting for interruption, but none came. Only a tightening, as if the house itself had drawn breath. Alara paled, clutching the brooch until it bit into her palm. "That's absurd," she hissed, her composure cracking like old porcelain. "That line, it's not legal, there's no name, this isn't binding." But Hemlow said nothing, only produced a second envelope, smaller, yellower, sealed not with wax but a dark thread stitched through the flap, as though to bind something inside. To be opened only if the Hollow stirs, it read. He hesitated, but the moment was already moving beyond him. A sudden gust rattled the window panes, though the trees outside were still. The air inside shifted, heavy and electric, and upstairs the long-sealed music room door clicked open with no visible hand. With shaking fingers, Hemlo cut the thread and unfolded the letter. The words inside were not typed, nor penned by legal hand. They were handwritten in the lady's looping, almost childlike script. The hollow keeps what the world cannot. She is not buried. She is kept. When the final chord is played, she will come. The house knows her name. Do not deny it. Before anyone could speak, the piano upstairs struck a single note, then another. A lullaby, barely audible, yet unmistakable to those who remembered. Alara stumbled back, her brooch falling from her hand and landing with a sharp metallic clink that echoed too long. Molly gasped, staring wide-eyed at the grand staircase where, for the briefest moment, a child's silhouette stood against the fading light, then vanished without sound. Reverend Alton muttered a prayer, but his voice shook. Tobias Gray, silent until now, stepped forward and said quietly, "Her name was Isadora, the twin no one mentions." She played the piano when Alara cried, and then he smiled, though it was not a kind smile, it was remembering. In the corner, a tall mirror began to frost at the edges. Harriet Culver dropped her glass. "There was no twin," she whispered, but her voice was less sure than her words. "There was only," but even she didn't finish. The last clause of the will, still unread, lay at the bottom of the page, now visible as Hemlo's trembling hands lowered the paper. "To Isadora Virilin, whose name was taken, whose voice was lost, this house remains yours. Welcome home." And as the final word was spoken, the fire roared to life in the hearth, though no match had been struck, and the scent of lavender and dust filled the room, exactly as it had on the night of the lady's first and final recital. Greystone Hollow had waited long enough. Its true heir had returned, and this time no one would be allowed to leave before the last note was played. The air in Renly House had the scent of old ink and unresolved secrets when Lenora Halcombe arrived, her gloved fingers grazing the carved banister with a familiarity that did not match the stranger she claimed to be. No one questioned her relation outright, but it was her eyes that unsettled the help, sharp, alert, and too calculating for grief. The solicitor had barely concluded the provisions of Eleanor Renly's peculiar will, yet Lenora accepted them with unnerving calm, her gaze flitting toward the attic staircase for only a heartbeat too long, as if expecting the shadow of someone who should no longer be there. Miss Talbot, ever watchful, noticed not the look itself, but the subtle withdrawal that followed, a step back, a breath held, the small betrayals of memory rather than mourning. Later, when the house was quiet, Miss Talbot passed the corridor where the family portrait hung, one that had always felt too curated, Eleanor in white lace, her brother Marcus seated beside her, yet the space between them oddly charged, as if the painter had captured not affection but a secret arrangement. Standing before it was Delia March, the housekeeper's niece, supposedly visiting out of kindness, though her eyes told a different story. She stared not at the painted faces, but at the folds in Eleanor's dress, where a book had once been hidden in life, now immortalized in canvas. Her hand lifted as though to touch it, then fell sharply, as if remembering it burned. Elsewhere in the village, whispers bloomed like bramble. Lenora's accent was too polished, her shoes too new, her story too rehearsed. Some said she wasn't English at all, others swore they'd seen her on the night Eleanor died, drenched and breathless on the moor. The postmaster recalled a parcel sent to a London archive weeks before the funeral, and young Elsie from the bakery claimed she'd seen Lenora near the graveyard, tracing letters not yet carved. The truth began to unravel gently, like damp thread, but it was the discovery in the vicarage study that turned quiet suspicion into sharpened dread, a faded ledger tucked behind volumes of forgotten sermons, pages brittle and annotated in a hand Miss Talbot recognized from Eleanor's correspondence. At the very back was a folded note, yellowed with age and sealed with wax long cracked, its message short but damning. Should the mirror break, the name will return, hide the key, she must not enter. That night, as wind rattled the windows and the fire coughed low embers, a sound echoed from above, a dragging step, a hollow creak, and then a crash. Rushing to the upper floor, Miss Talbot and Delia found the attic door ajar, though it had been bolted for over a decade. Inside, amid dust and time, stood an antique cheval mirror, shattered from within, and in its fractured glass was not their reflection, but a woman neither had seen before, standing far too still, her eyes full of recognition, and her mouth half open, as if she'd been waiting to speak the truth no one had dared to name. Rain clung to the windows of Blackthorn Grange, like long-forgotten tears, trailing down the glass in sluggish rivulets, as a low wind groaned across the moors outside, a sound that seemed less like weather and more like something breathing. Inside, the lamps had dimmed to their final flickers, shadows coiling across the drawing-room, where Miss Eliza Hawthorne sat motionless in a stiff-backed chair, her teacup untouched, her eyes narrowed not in fear, but in a cold, surgical anticipation. Upstairs, the others were gathered for evening prayers, the housekeeper Mrs. Whitcomb leading in her trembling voice, the others murmuring along, except for Florence, who had begged off with a headache, and young Peter, last seen wandering near the west wing, where no one dared go after nightfall. But then, just as the grandfather clock in the hall struck 11, a sound too rich, too hollow, it was as if the house exhaled. A crash echoed down from the second floor, so sudden and sharp that the floorboards seemed to vibrate. Candles guttered. Mrs. Whitcomb let out a strangled gasp, dropping her rosary, while Reverend Mott ran toward the staircase, his slippered feet barely silent on the carpet. When they reached the old nursery, the room no one had entered since the fire that took little Clara's life 8 winters ago, the door stood wide open, though it had been nailed shut years earlier. Inside, the air was strangely still, perfumed with something faintly sweet, like burnt lilac and something more metallic beneath. There, in the rocking chair by the broken window, sat the body of Mr. Adrian Levington, the solicitor who had returned to the Grange just 3 days prior under the pretense of revisiting the family's will. His face was pale, almost serene, tilted to one side in a gesture too deliberate to be peaceful, his fingers curled loosely around a child's ribbon blue, satin frayed at one end. The doctor, summoned in haste, offered a vague cause, heart failure perhaps or stroke, though his tone lacked conviction and his eyes refused to meet anyone else's. But Miss Hawthorne, still downstairs, did not wait for declarations. She ascended slowly once the others had been ushered away, and when she stepped into the nursery, something in her countenance shifted, slightly but unmistakably, as if a long-feared certainty had finally arrived. On the floor near the body, half concealed beneath a warped floorboard, lay a small silver rattle, blackened with age, initials etched into the side, C.H. Clara Hawthorne. Miss Eliza knelt without touching it, her gloved fingers hovering above the metal, as if sensing the heat of a secret still smouldering beneath its surface. Downstairs, Peter was found hiding in the pantry, silent and wide-eyed, clutching a torn piece of lace he refused to let go. He hadn't spoken since. The constable, newly assigned to the parish and too eager to impress, suggested a prowler or a vagrant, a tale of burglary gone awry, but nothing had been taken, no window forced, no lock tampered with. The valuables, the heirloom rings, even the gold carriage clock, everything lay untouched, gathering the dust of generations. What had been taken, Miss Eliza understood, was not material. It was memory, it was silence. The murder was not an act of rage but a ritual, a reenactment, a message passed through time disguised in nostalgia. That ribbon had not been seen since Clara's death, and yet here it was, in the dead man's hand. The nursery, long sealed, bore no footprints but one, small, bare, impossible. As the house fell quiet once more, and thunder rolled gently in the distance like a forgotten lullaby, Miss Eliza whispered to no one in particular. She was never gone, only waiting. And in that moment it became clear, the past had never died at Blackthorn Grange, it had only learned to wait in the walls. The scent lingered, faint yet unmistakable, not the acrid tang of furniture polish or mothballs, but something softer, older, a fragile trace of iris and crushed lavender, the sort of scent worn by women whose lives had long since slipped into habit and memory, rather than style. It brushed past Eleanor Bainbridge's senses as she passed through the narrow hall connecting the blue parlour to the solarium, and though she paused only momentarily, the thought lodged itself with quiet insistence. No one in the household wore lavender, Mrs. Partridge preferred orange flower water, Cecilia Talbot never wore any scent at all, and young Marian, with her modern airs and half-buttoned collars, had declared all perfumes bourgeois affectations. And yet Eleanor had smelled it before recently, when passing the butler's staircase late at night, and once more most vividly the day before the incident, when Mrs. Talbot's cousin Miss Evangeline Rowe had brushed past her in the drawing-room, a woman who claimed to have lost her sense of smell after an illness, and yet always seemed vaguely fragrant, like linen pressed beside an herb sachet. That afternoon, after the incident but before the questions began, Eleanor had stood by the greenhouse windows, pretending to examine the azaleas, but her thoughts were elsewhere. When the inspector assembled them in the main hall, his tone clipped, formal, already bracing against the fog of evasions. Each person spoke in turn. Evangeline claimed to have been composing correspondence in the upstairs study, though the ink on her fingers was dry, and no one remembered hearing the desk chair creak. Marian said she'd gone out riding, though her boots bore no trace of mud, and the groom reported the stable doors hadn't opened until well after noon. Cecilia, cool and brittle as glass, simply stated she had been in the library cataloguing her father's books, but when asked which volume she had last handled, she faltered. Eleanor watched, quiet as ever, absorbing not just the answers but the rhythm of them, the way Evangeline smoothed her skirt between sentences, the silence between questions growing longer with each round, as if the air itself were becoming aware of the lie. Later, as twilight stretched its fingers across the walls, Eleanor wandered to the linen closet, ostensibly in search of a shawl, but truly following something less tangible, a hunch, a thread. Behind a shelf of old christening blankets, she found a small lacquered box, its hinges delicate, its lock long broken. Inside, beneath layers of old handkerchiefs and a child's hair ribbon, was a folded note, paper yellowed and edges softened by years. The writing was tight, looped, familiar. "You think silence is safer than truth," it began, "but silence has a cost. You left me to carry it alone. There was no name, no signature, only a date. The year of Cecilia's brother's drowning, a tragedy always spoken of with strained brevity and hollow platitudes." Eleanor stood for a long moment, the note trembling slightly between her fingers, as if even now it resisted being read, and in that moment she understood. The incident was not sudden, nor spontaneous, but seeded long ago. The motive was not money, nor jealousy, but weight carried too long, quietly passed between women who smiled and drank tea and never spoke of the day the rowboat overturned. Lavender, she thought again, was not simply perfume, it was memory, and some memories long pressed between pages will still stain your fingers when reopened. The storm had not yet broken, but the skies above Blackthorn House hung heavy with the kind of silence that feels borrowed, not from the sky, but from the past itself, like some forgotten breath held too long beneath the floorboards. There was something in the air that evening, something deeper than the rain and more brittle than the wind, when Miss Elspeth Aldwyn stepped back into the drawing-room she had not visited since the winter of 1903, when the house had last seen morning lace and shadowed mirrors. The faint tick of the grandfather clock echoed like a heartbeat lost in time, and on the mantel above the hearth sat a frame, brass tarnished, slightly askew, the child within it painted with a half-smile too cold to be innocent. Elspeth's eyes drifted downward to the envelope beside it, its edges scorched and curled, as though the fire had tried to consume it but been stopped or interrupted. Inside, half a letter, crisp with age but sharp in message. "He is not my father," she knew, she always knew. The handwriting was small, rushed, as though written in hiding, in fear, or worse, in defiance. That night, unable to still the noise inside her head, Elspeth wandered toward the old conservatory, long abandoned and bolted since the day the youngest Ashcroft girl vanished without a trace. Yet the door gave way with barely a protest, revealing a room choked with vines, dust and silence. Behind a collapsed shelf of shattered terracotta pots, she unearthed a child's wooden soldier, headless, the torso hollowed out, and something once hidden inside now gone. Wrapped around it was a fragment of embroidered linen. Initials stitched in tiny desperate loops. SC, not a name in the family, not among the servants, not in any record Elspeth had ever known. And yet it felt familiar. The air turned sour then, from mildew and figs to something metallic, like old blood remembered by the earth itself. 3 days later, the village solicitor Mr. Thorne, who had handled the estate's affairs for 40 years, was found collapsed over his desk, heart stopped, his final act unfinished, save for one phrase left ink-stained on his blotter. "Ask the woman with crimson gloves." No such woman lived in Blackthorn, nor had any been seen, except, and it was a weak thread but it held, except for the stories once muttered by the now-forgotten gardener, who in his dementia repeated a single tale, of a girl, not from the family, seen leaving the chapel ruins with blood on her hands, and a silence in her eyes so deep it could drown saints. Elspeth, driven not by fear but something more primal, recognition, returned to the ruins at dawn, following instinct more than evidence. There, beneath the altar stones, half lifted by time and rot, she found a rusted tin box bound with ribbon stiff from age. Inside, letters never sent, written in an increasingly unsteady hand, all addressed to Charlotte, a name never listed in the Ashcroft genealogy. The final letter read, barely legible, "She buried it. I saw her, I heard the cry, I never told. She said it was mercy. What had been buried was not just a body. Elspeth was certain of that now, but a secret older than her own memory, a sin braided so tightly into the family fabric that even the walls whispered of it. The embroidery, the half-burnt letter, the soldier, the name Charlotte, they were not disconnected clues but echoes of a truth too ugly for daylight and too dangerous for memory. Back at the house, in the attic behind boxes of pressed gowns and moth-eaten lace, Elspeth found the family ledger, the real one, and tucked within it a second, smaller volume, not financial records but payments, all anonymous, all regular, each December, to ensure continued discretion. Elspeth's breath caught. The name beside each payment was always the same, Zara L., the former governess who vanished after the frost of '89. No one had looked for her, no one had asked. Her disappearance had been explained with a vague nod toward marriage abroad, a fiction everyone accepted because the truth was more costly, and now the fabric of that lie had begun to tear. Elspeth turned toward the window as the first thunder finally cracked, rain beginning not gently but violently, and in that moment she realized this story was not hers to discover, it was hers to reveal. What had been hidden was not just scandal or betrayal, it was something feral, something passed down in silence, something that had grown claws in the dark. And as the rain smeared the dust from the glass and the house groaned as if remembering, Elspeth knew to pull at one thread now would not unravel a mystery, it would unravel a history. It was on a frost-tinged morning where the breath of winter still clung to the moss-laden gravestones of Grystone Parish, and mist weaved like old secrets through the churchyard paths, that Miss Evangeline Hartley first noticed her again. Not a child, and yet not quite grown, the woman stood beneath the gnarled yew tree, a tree older than the village itself, as though she belonged to a time no longer remembered. She didn't move. Her shawl was thin, threadbare, clutched tightly at the collar, and her eyes were cast downward in a kind of silent reverence or mourning. But it wasn't her stillness that struck Miss Hartley. It was the hum, low, fragmented, almost unconscious, the way someone breathes out a song remembered not from the mind, but from the marrow. The melody was unmistakable, though its words had long been lost to time. The Thistle's Lullaby, a tune never written in hymnals, passed down only by ear in the once grand Berrington household. Arabella, the little girl who had perished in the fire, had sung it often in the gardens while chasing her doll through lavender hedges. That melody had faded from the village, the same night the flames consumed the nursery. And yet here it was, bleeding through the silence again, humming through lips that barely seemed aware they were moving, as if grief had become a language all its own. Miss Hartley didn't interrupt. She simply watched as the girl suddenly halted, startled, as though waking from a dream, unaware she'd ever begun to sing at all. Later that week, while cataloguing donation ledgers inside the dim archive room of the parish house, Miss Hartley stumbled upon something peculiar, a small slip of browned parchment, wedged between pages of forgotten records. Upon unfolding it she found a child's drawing, crude but chilling, a faceless figure hand in hand with something labelled only as Mama's ghost. The drawing was scorched at the edges, as if rescued from fire. Alarm bells rang in her mind. She took it to the vicar, but he only gave a nervous chuckle, vaguely recalling rumours of the Berrington family scandal, a missing governess, whispers of madness, a trial that never came. Compelled by something beyond curiosity, perhaps duty, perhaps dread, Evangeline ascended the north wing of the now-abandoned Berrington estate one dusky evening. The manor had become a skeleton of itself, windows shattered, wallpaper peeling like burnt skin. The north wing, sealed after the tragedy, groaned with every step she took across its warped floorboards. At the very end of the corridor, in a narrow bedroom with a sagging ceiling and the faint scent of smoke, she uncovered a hidden compartment beneath a loose board. Inside was a biscuit tin wrapped in linen and bound with a fraying crimson ribbon. No dust covered it, no cobwebs, as though someone had placed it there recently. Within the tin were relics that did not belong together, yet formed a terrible kind of harmony. A lock of golden hair, brittle and still scented faintly of lavender soap. A wax doll melted down one side, its face distorted. A torn fragment of hymn paper bearing the words "Do not forget her name," and at the very bottom, folded so carefully it trembled in her hands, was a note scrawled in childlike writing. She wasn't supposed to wake up. I only wanted her quiet. Evangeline's breath caught. This wasn't just tragedy. This was confession. This was consequence wrapped in the guise of childhood innocence. The next morning, while pouring tea into chipped porcelain, the housekeeper, Mrs. Radley, casually mentioned something strange. Weeks earlier, just after dusk, a woman had come knocking at the rectory door. Pale, trembling, her coat soaked from rain, she'd asked only one question: "Does the thistle still sing?" Then, without waiting for an answer, she had vanished into the fog, leaving behind only the scent of smoke and something like old lilacs. Miss Hartley's heart pounded. The song, the tin, the drawing. None of this was coincidence. This was memory resurfacing, not invited but demanding to be reckoned with. Driven by a hunch, Evangeline returned to the yew tree where the girl had stood. She brought a lantern, knowing dusk would fall quickly. At the base of the tree, beneath crumbling soil and tangled roots, her spade struck wood. Digging gently, she unearthed a child's sampler, the kind young girls once stitched in schoolrooms. The thread was faded, weather-worn, but the message was clear. "Forgive me, even if I sang." She stared at it, her fingers trembling. This was no longer about what had happened long ago. It was about what had been silenced, what had festered in the quiet, and what was now pushing through the cracks of time to be heard. The past, Evangeline thought, never truly stays buried. It lingers, in lullabies half-remembered, in smoke that refuses to clear, in footsteps heard on staircases long sealed shut, and sometimes, when the air is cold and still, it sings. It was a dusky autumn evening when Miss Eleanor Whitcomb, retired historian of lost inheritances and long-forgotten scandals, stood alone in the old conservatory of the Ashcombe estate, her eyes fixed on a velvet ribbon wedged behind the panelling, brittle with age, and tied in a knot so deliberate it whispered of secrets buried with care. The house, a crumbling relic of faded grandeur, exhaled silence in uneasy rhythms, as though it knew someone had finally come to disturb its long-standing pact with the past. Eleanor's fingers, gloved but trembling, worked the ribbon loose and retrieved what had been hidden within the wall. A sealed envelope, yellowed and wax-stamped with the Willoughby crest, a family name all but erased from polite conversation since the fire that claimed young Adelaide's life 23 years earlier. Inside the envelope lay not a letter, but a delicate sketch of two girls, one labelled A and the other E, beneath which was scrawled in a child's uncertain hand, "Only one could stay." That night, the air in Ashcombe felt heavier, the mirrors darker, and Eleanor knew this was no ordinary family tragedy. Over the following days, she unearthed fragments scattered like breadcrumbs across time, a torn baptismal record that named a child not as Adelaide Willoughby, but as Edith Hale, a diary entry from a nursemaid who vanished the week of the fire, and a half-burnt theatre programme hidden inside a false drawer in the nursery, with the words, "She saw too much," circled in crimson ink. No one in the village ever spoke of Edith Hale, and Adelaide's portrait, once the pride of the drawing-room, had long been taken down and locked away in the cellar. When Eleanor quietly summoned the remaining heirs to the Ashcombe study one pale afternoon, there were no accusations, no formal charges, only a gentle request, posed with a calmness that chilled. Beatrice, the eldest, arrived first, her composure worn like an armor stitched from decades of denial. Frederick next looked haunted, as if the ghost of what he had allowed had followed him through every year of silence, and young Clara, barely 20, sat far from the fire, her knuckles white against the armrest, as though bracing for truths she had suspected but never dared name. Eleanor, seated beneath the faded gaze of a long-dead matriarch's portrait, spoke not like a judge but like a weaver unraveling a tapestry strand by strand. She explained that Edith Hale had not died in the fire, but had been smuggled out, sent away and reborn under a new identity by those desperate to preserve a carefully constructed legacy. Adelaide, it seemed, had never existed, not truly, but was created from Edith's likeness, a replacement child after a stillbirth, raised in privilege but never in truth. And when the real Edith uncovered the deception, the fire had been no accident. There was no cry, no protest, just silence as each face around her paled, realizing the weight of the years they had lived under a lie. The final piece Eleanor laid before them was not a will, not a confession, but a single phrase, written in a young girl's desperate hand and preserved in a sealed locket. "They said I'd forget, but I remember everything." As the room grew unbearably quiet, a wind passed through the cracked panes of the study, cold, old and knowing, and Eleanor understood. Some truths are not uncovered, they demand to be seen, even if it means burning down what's left of the lie. It was a cloud-thick dusk when Miss Heloise Marchmont gathered the household at Ashgrove Manor, not by decree but with a suggestion so calmly uttered over the silver clink of teaspoons that none could refuse. The drawing-room, once a place of polite echoes and lace-curtained light, now sat in hushed suspense, its occupants carefully arranged like pieces on a chessboard awaiting the final fatal move. First came Isadora Vala, crisp as a pressed telegram, with eyes that darted not from nerves but calculation. Then followed Rupert Vale, silent and pale, his usual bravado replaced with a haunted inwardness. Miss Edith Holloway, governess turned ghost of the house, hovered by the mantel, her fingers unconsciously tracing the outline of a pendant long hidden beneath her collar. And in the farthest armchair, as if trying to dissolve into brocade, sat young Maisie, head low but with ears sharp as blades. Miss Marchmont, wrapped in grey wool and serenity, did not rise. She merely glanced to the corner of the room, where Constable Farlow stood stiffly, eyes alert, breath held. "This house," she began softly, "has kept its secrets tucked under floorboards and folded into linens for far too long, but secrets do not vanish, they stain, and the stain here is of blood, and of memory." No one spoke. The death of Reverend Ambrose was not the beginning, merely the fracture through which old truths leaked. I came across a document, scorched at the edges but legible, a birth record. Not for Isadora or Maisie, but for one Eleanor Marin Vale, born to a Cecilia Holloway in the winter of 1908. The name was struck through, the father unnamed, but someone had scrawled in the margin transferred, Ashgrove. Edith's breath caught, and Rupert's gaze snapped toward her. "I believe," Miss Marchmont continued, voice even, "that Eleanor did not die as the story claimed. I believe she was renamed, absorbed and silenced, a child repurposed for reputation's sake. That child was Maisie." The silence that followed was brittle. Maisie lifted her head slightly, confusion and something deeper, fear, shadowing her face. There was a lullaby, Marchmont added, not in the common tongue but in the old Romani dialect, heard once in the nursery, noted by a maid dismissed, but it matched one in Cecilia Holloway's diary, hidden in a piano bench. Edith's lips quivered, yet still she said nothing. "I have reason to believe the Reverend knew. Perhaps not all, but enough. He wrote letters not to the authorities but to Rupert, pleading for the truth to come forth now that the inheritance was under review. And those letters vanished, but not before they were read. Rupert's knuckles whitened. "You see," Miss Marchmont said quietly, "Ambrose did not fall from the bell tower. He was pushed, and the person who pushed him did so with a mind full of panic and a heart full of lies. The Reverend had discovered the adoption, the inheritance fraud, and more crucially, the disappearance of the real Marin child. The Holloways took in Eleanor after Cecilia's disgrace, and when the chance came to replace a dying heir with a living one, they took it. Eleanor became Maisie, and the will was rewritten in her name, a legacy salvaged through deception. But Ambrose, that quiet old man with his sharp eyes and meticulous notes, began piecing it together. His sermons shifted. More veiled references, more stares at Maisie, more pressure on Rupert. And so, on a night when the house was distracted by the storm, Rupert followed him to the tower with a singular resolve. Rupert opened his mouth but found no voice. Miss Marchmont's gaze turned to Edith. "But you, Miss Holloway, you helped plant the lie. You were Cecilia's sister. You raised Eleanor in this house, and though guilt weighted your bones all these years, you stayed silent." Edith nodded slowly, a tear spilling despite herself. "It was to protect her," she whispered, "to give her a life untouched by shame." Miss Marchmont's expression softened, but now it has touched everything. From her knitting basket she drew the final piece, a child's sampler, initials embroidered in thread now faded to the shade of old plum, EMV. Found hidden behind a false panel in the nursery wall, wrapped around the blood-stained cufflink Ambrose had torn from Rupert's coat. "Justice," she said simply, "has threads longer than any of us expect, but eventually they reach their end." The room stayed still, frozen under the weight of truth unearthed. Then came the slow clink of Constable Fallow's handcuffs, and the brittle exhale of a house finally freed from its silence. Beneath the waning glow of dusk, as shadows stretched long across the crooked garden path of the Evermere estate, Miss Althea Hargrove stood motionless by the arched window of the east chamber, her gaze fixed on the ivy-wrapped statue that for decades had marked the grave of someone never truly buried. She turned at last, her voice a mere whisper thick with time. "There was a lullaby once, sung only by a mother who feared being heard, hummed into the hollow of midnight, a lullaby no one should remember. And yet you did, Clara." The girl, no, the woman now froze, her breath catching, for the tune had indeed slipped from her lips days ago by the garden well, an unconscious murmur born from the corners of memory that language had long abandoned. Miss Hargrove moved toward the hearth and reached for a frame nestled between dusty books, a child's embroidery sampler, the stitches uneven, the thread old but deliberate. "She lied, and I paid," it read, each letter punctuated not with innocence but pain, betrayal, and the bitter finality of abandonment. "Your mother stitched this," she murmured, not out of craft but out of grief, for a daughter she was forced to give away, and a secret she could never reclaim. Clara's knees weakened beneath the weight of that truth, too long suppressed, now bleeding through every thread and whisper of the room. Miss Hargrove turned to her again, "And there were the scissors," she said quietly, holding up the gold-handled embroidery shears that glinted with faded memory. "Locked away for years, untouched, yet carrying the faintest scent of violets, your mother's perfume, the same scent that trailed you when you entered this house, as if time itself had bent to echo the past." Across the room, Edward Stanlow, the family solicitor, stiffened at the implication. "And we must not forget," she continued, "the letter found wedged behind the nursery wall, torn but intact enough to name the child stolen under the veil of fire and fear. Eliza, not Clara. Eliza Aldwyn." The name struck like thunder. Clara. Eliza looked down at her trembling hands that had never quite fit the gloves given to her by the Ashburys, the family who claimed her from the convent all those years ago after the accidental fire at Bellwether Manor. "It wasn't an accident, was it?" she whispered, voice raw. Miss Hargrove gave a slow nod, eyes darkening. "No, it was orchestrated, to erase you, to replace you, and someone ensured the blaze consumed not just the wing of the house but the records, the proof." Clara's face paled. "So who?" Miss Hargrove turned, her tone sharpening. "The fire was no act of rage but of design, and the design was Clarion Ashbury's, your adopted uncle." A chill swept through the room. "He feared what would happen if your lineage was known. The Aldwyn estate, entangled with debts and silence, would have passed not to him but to you. And so he buried you in smoke and soot, only to later raise you as his niece, hiding you in plain sight, confident no one would piece it together. But he hadn't accounted for the keepsakes, the lullaby, the sampler, the scissors, and most of all," she paused, her voice now as sharp as the shears, "he hadn't accounted for guilt." She moved to the desk and opened a drawer, revealing a small glass vial, a poison-long band, its contents nearly depleted. He did not die peacefully, she said flatly. He took his own life days ago, not from shame but from fear. Someone had left him a note, no name, just one sentence. She remembers. The inspector in the corner, silent until now, stepped forward. Then who sent the note? Miss Hargrove's eyes flicked toward the shadows of the staircase, and from them emerged Cecily, Clara's childhood maid, thought long gone. I did, she said, her voice weathered but firm. I saw her hum the lullaby. I knew then my Eliza had returned. The room trembled, not from sound but revelation. Clara's breath trembled, but she did not cry. Instead she asked only, what happens now? Miss Hargrove placed a hand on her shoulder. Now, the estate will pass to its rightful heir. But the legacy, that is yours to shape. Outside, the rain had stopped. The roses, wild and half-drowned, glistened under the weight of water and secrets. Eliza stepped toward the window, her reflection half-shadowed, half-whole. The silence that followed was not the suffocating hush of secrets held, but the soft exhale of truth released. Nothing would ever be the same, and yet for the first time in her life, everything made sense. Beneath the brooding grey sky of Elmswick Hollow, where the fog clung low to the ground like a secret not yet whispered, the old Carradine manor stirred once more. It had stood silent for decades, save for the echo of wind that twisted through its cracked shutters and ivy-strangled eaves. But today, its halls trembled again under the weight of returning footsteps, those of Eleanor Graves, a woman not born of the Hollow but tethered to it by blood, shadow and a long-buried scandal. She had arrived not in grandeur but in a modest coat, 2 buttons short of whole, her suitcase fraying at the edges, her eyes darker than any storm. The village watched her return with the careful gaze of people who remembered too much but spoke too little. Only the aged Reverend Merrin met her at the gate, not with welcome but with a scripture verse unspoken yet sharp in the air. What is done in darkness shall be brought to light. In the days that followed, Eleanor moved through the manor not as a guest but as a question. Her presence unsettled the walls, stirred the ash in the hearth, and turned the heads of villagers who passed the estate a little quicker than before. She had come not for inheritance, she said, but for truth, for the story never told, the letter never sent, the twin sister buried beneath a name that wasn't hers. Every step through the dust-caked halls uncovered slivers of that night 30 years ago, the broken locket hidden in the piano bench, the blood-stained hem tucked beneath a loose floorboard, the diary entry dated the night of the winter solstice, its final line reading only, "He knows." And then came the strange occurrences, always at twilight, doors unlocked that hadn't opened in decades, the scent of heather and burnt paper lingering where no one had stood, and the mirror in the east hallway, long-rumoured cursed, reflected not Eleanor's image, but a girl in lace with eyes full of terror and lips mouthing run. It was Mrs. Aldwych, the retired housekeeper now half-blind and twice as bitter, who first broke her silence. You weren't the only one who left, she rasped by the hearth one rain-soaked evening, but you might be the only one who came back still breathing. She spoke then of the final night, the night Madeline Carradine vanished. A ball had been planned, an engagement announced, but by dawn only whispers remained, and a veil found floating in the garden pond. No investigation, no scandal, only a sealed room and a paid silence. And yet the manor never truly slept. It was in that very room, the west chamber locked by rust and memory, that Eleanor found what had been hidden, a second will, dated the night before the disappearance, naming not Madeline but Eleanor as heir to the Carradine legacy. The ink had run from water damage, but the signature, bold and angular, was unmistakably that of Augustus Carradine, her estranged father. With trembling hands she lit the fireplace for the first time in years, and in its flickering glow saw the final proof, a torn piece of Madeline's gown caught between the floorboards and the cold stone beneath. And there, scrawled in charcoal on the underside of the wood, a single word etched in desperate haste, betrayer. The truth unravelled not in a scream, but in stillness. Eleanor turned to the mirror, now bare of fog, and saw not herself, but her sister, not accusing but sorrowful, lips parted as though to say, "You were never meant to be the sacrifice." By morning Eleanor left the manor, not with estate papers nor a claim, but with the will in one hand and her sister's locket in the other. She made no claim to the Carradine wealth, only a request to reopen the village orphanage once funded by the family trust. The manor was entrusted to historical preservation, locked once more but not abandoned. As spring settled, the village returned to its rhythm, though now with softened edges. The bakery reopened, the church bell found its voice again, and Eleanor, now working in the schoolhouse, became not a curiosity but a presence, quiet, kind, and known for humming unfamiliar lullabies near dusk. As for the west chamber, it remained untouched. Some doors, the villagers agreed, should remain closed, not out of fear, but out of reverence for the echoes that sleep behind them. Miss Alder, the village historian, once asked Eleanor why she had truly returned. She answered not with words, but with a glance toward the manor, where the roses, once strangled by shadow, now bloomed early and bold along the gate. The past had not been defeated, it had been acknowledged, and in that peace was not claimed but earned. There was tragedy, yes, but not merely for the one who fell. True sorrow clung like mist around those who chose to survive at the cost of others, who stitched their lives together with lies, believing those threads could hold against time. In Elderwick Hollow, the past did not simply haunt, it whispered from stone walls, from attic trunks, from lullabies long left unfinished. What shook Miss Langley most was not the crime itself, but the hollow spaces it carved in the lives it touched, particularly in Eleanor, the woman once erased, renamed, reshaped by hands not her own. She hadn't returned to demand what was owed, or burn down what had grown on her grief. No, she returned only to see, to understand, to take back the pieces of herself that had been scattered so carefully no one noticed the theft. She refused the estate not in anger, but in quiet dignity, her decision echoing louder than any courtroom verdict. Instead, she chose the forgotten gatekeeper's cottage on the edge of the moors, where roses grew wild and the fog didn't question your name. There, she planted herbs and read to children under the ancient oak, building something honest from the ground up. Miss Langley, in her drawing room stitched with afternoon light, often paused her embroidery to reflect not on villains or victims, but on choices, on the delicate architecture of survival. Even Nathaniel Price, sharp of mind and cold of heart, met not the fury of the town but the weight of his own silence, a man who believed secrets could be catalogued like artifacts, yet who failed to see that truth, like mold, grows even in locked spaces. The sampler, once feared, once hidden, now hung not in judgment but in mourning, its threadbare warning she was forgotten, and I was made, had transformed. No longer did it accuse, now it confessed. It spoke of generations built on a foundation that never belonged to them, of women turned into ghosts, and daughters folded into lies until they no longer recognized their reflections. Miss Langley knew now that justice was never about retribution, it was the long aching task of restoration, of placing names back where they had been stolen, of reopening rooms sealed by shame, of singing lullabies in the names they were meant for. And so the story didn't end with applause or gavel strikes, it ended in breath. In the moment a lie exhales after years of holding its breath. The village resumed its rhythm, market bells rang, children laughed, and yet there lingered something sacred in the air, something unspoken but deeply felt. Miss Langley tied off her final loop with fingers that trembled not from age, but from understanding. Her gaze lingered on the window pane, where the reflection of the sampler merged with the rose garden behind it, as though time itself had stitched something whole. And she murmured, not to anyone, but to the memory itself, truth always finds its seam. And now, dear listener, the question turns to you. If the story of your life rested upon a single forgotten thread, would you dare pull it, knowing the entire fabric may unravel? Would you walk away from a legacy spun of stolen light, or wear it like a crown? Share your answer in the comments. We treasure your thoughts, for they keep these shadows alive. If this tale stirred something in you, subscribe for more mysteries embroidered in silence, and pass it on to someone who understands that sometimes the most haunting truths are not screamed, they are whispered, gently from behind doors we've been too afraid to open. Until our next tale, stay curious and remember, even the quietest corners remember, and truth, no matter how deeply buried, always finds a way to bloom.